No, Donald Trump's extremist policies that he wants to enact that mirror Project 2025 are not illegal or unconstitutional under his administration, and this is why. Now, our current rule of law is derived from constitutional authority, that is Article 6, Supremacy Clause. Now, to further understand this point, check out my pinned video on courts. But the issue with this victory isn't whether Donald Trump won, but whether a victory is legitimate under the constitutional supremacy and authority. To understand, you have to go to that video and then come back here. But upon his inauguration, it means a complete abandonment of the constitutional supremacy for Trump supremacy. This means that the rule of law is no longer derived from the Constitution, but from Trump. This means that he's capable of reshaping the rule of law. And as such, the Constitution becomes suggestions and recommendations because it's now a dictatorship. Because we removed the power from the people through the collective of the Constitution and gave it to one man. For what? A promise of a concept of economic prosperity. And I need you to be careful with this rhetoric because I see a lot of Democrats acting like it'll be just another day to have Trump in the White House, when in fact constitutional legitimacy collapses because of what I explained in the video. The norms and policy and constitutional mechanisms, including checks and balances, are now recommendations post his inauguration. So in that reality, under a Trump presidency, it is not illegal corruption because it becomes the norm. Why? Because the Constitution is now silent. There is now a constitutional crisis. Now, as I've said in other videos and throughout history and dictatorships, they prefer to uphold that illusion that they are in alignment with the Constitution. Usually, a lot of that violence is produced from the social level through like secret police. And also through complacency. See, during the Holocaust, the Nazis weren't just going to every single Jewish household and picking them up. They would send letters to them, and they would willingly go to that location to be transferred over to the camps. Why? Because they didn't want to resist. They felt like they needed to maintain their dignity and not be dragged out by the Nazis. As a result, 6 million Jews were unalived. But under the Nazis, all of that they were doing was legal. It was lawful. Why? Because the dictator created the rule of law. Donald Trump will become the rule of law post-inauguration. And I need to emphasize the fact that this is not a reality that is real because I dislike his policies, because I dislike XYZ. It is based on the reality that there are constitutional violations that would produce his disqualification and illegitimate control of the United States of America based on what he did or willingly didn't do in order to delay the certification process, which is a constitutional process. Had January 6th the same scenario happen on January 2nd when there was no constitutional process, then it would not be an insurrection. But because there was an intent to delay and change the election results, it meant there was an intent to unlawfully and unconstitutionally delay the certification process and therefore change it. Now, what we have to understand is that breaking the Constitution is much more severe, or should be much more severe, than breaking the law. The United States Constitution can change the law, but the law cannot change the U.S. Constitution. Only Article 5, the Amendment Clause, can change the U.S. Constitution. But this is only a reality where there is legitimacy and the social contract. But in a post-inauguration, there is no legitimacy in the social contract. We enter into a constitutional crisis. The reality becomes that your state government becomes de facto executive. It is your last frontier against removal of your liberties. This is no help if you're in a red state. I'm sorry. Because when in this reality, there are two versions of violence. There's political violence from the state, and state just means a government, from the government, and there is social violence from the community at large. Usually mass-scaled violence that is organized. Red states will face both. Blue states will face social violence within pockets around it. The only political avenue in a post-inauguration America is for Trump himself to trigger political reactions from blue states. And this reality, where Trump tries to punish or force legislation that he will position as was done constitutionally and per rule of law, state governments have the right to use the full extent of our powers to reject the authority of the illegitimate federal government, the executive, and all the branches that fail to uphold a loyalty to the United States Constitution. Federalist 78 by Alexander Hamilton. If a single member should attempt to usurp the supreme authority, the United States Constitution per supremacy clause, okay? The social contract, not public opinion, social contract, which means that social contract supremacy goes above democracy. I'm sorry, that was a tone for all of those who are like, no, the Constitution cannot override our votes. Yes, it can. If a single member should attempt to usurp the supreme authority, he could not be supposed to have an equal authority and credit in all the Confederate states, which means that your state government will be the last frontier to uphold your liberty, to uphold the constitutional values that hopefully we would be capable of restoring federally. Were he to have too great influence over one, this would alarm the rest. Were he to subdue a part, that which would still remain free might oppose him with forces independent of those which he had usurped and overpower him before he could be settled in his usurpation. Sorry, that word is kind of tricky to say for me, so I'm just going to say invasion, which is the same thing. What does this mean? For example, California can use our power, including all types of power, including our National Guard, to protect Californian interests against an illegitimate takeover and invasion. Alexander Hamilton continues, should a popular insurrection happen in one of the Confederate states, the others are able to quell it. Should abuses creep into one part, they are reformed by those that remain sound. Now listen to this part. The Confederacy, which is the country, may be dissolved, and the Confederates preserve their sovereignty. So even if the Union has to dissolve, the states will maintain our constitutional sovereignty. If the federal government wants to restore the constitutionality that was being sacrificed, then perfect, we're a union. But if not, to this I answer that force is to be opposed to nothing but to unjust and unlawful force. For the exceeding the bounds of authority is no more a right and a great than in a petty officer, no more justifiable in a king than a constable, but is so much the worse in him, in that he has more trust put in him, has already a much greater share than the rest of his brethren, and is supposed from the advantages of his education, employment, and counselors to be more knowing in the measures of right and wrong. And this is why I say that if the courts fail to decide on the insurrection case prior to January 20 inauguration, which I know is unrealistic timeline, but this is unprecedented times and moments, it collapses the constitutional legitimacy because it sacrificed constitutional authority for Trump authority. There can be no pretense for force which is only to be used where man is intercepted from appealing to the law, for nothing is to be accounted hostile force, but where it leaves not the remedy of such an appeal, and it is such force alone that puts him that uses it into a state of war and makes it lawful to resist him. Wherever law ends, tyranny begins. John Locke, the Two Treaties of Government, aka the father of the social contract, which is literally the influence behind the social contract. Governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Now, this was 1776, the Declaration of Independence, but after 1789, the consent by the governed was in public opinion, it was constitutional authority per Article 6. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem more likely to affect their safety and happiness. A post-Trump reality will dissolve our institutions as we know it, but we will become better. We will transform, and we're going to have to suffer a lot, but hey,